On Saturday, 13 December 2025, Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz addressed a gathering of members of his party, the CDU-CSU. On the occasion, Merz announced that Pax Americana was over and suggested that Germany had to prepare for war against Russia.
Ich komme gleich im Zusammenhang mit der Außen- und Sicherheitspolitik darauf noch einmal zu sprechen, aber liebe Freundinnen und Freunde, die Jahrzehnte der Pax Americana sind für uns in Europa und auch für uns in Deutschland weitestgehend vorbei. Es gibt es nicht mehr so, wie wir sie kennengelernt haben. Und da hilft auch keine Nostalgie. Und ich wäre einer der Letzten, der sich dieser Nostalgie nicht gerne hingeben würde. Aber es nützt nichts. Es ist so. Die Amerikaner nehmen jetzt sehr, sehr hart ihre eigenen Interessen wahr.
Perhaps, as NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte put it, it should be the kind of war like our grandparents and great-grandparents endured.
Russia has brought war back to Europe, and we must be prepared for the scale of war our grandparents and great-grandparents endured.
As it happens, Friedrich Merz's parents and grandparents knew something about that war. His father, Alois Merz, was a member of the Nazi National Socialist Party since the early 1930s. His maternal grandfather, Joseph Paul Sauvigny, was a high-ranking Nazi officer in Adolf Hitler's service during World War II. In his speech, Merz implied that Russia's President Vladimir Putin was the Hitler of our time. He warned his applauding colleagues that, quote, "If Ukraine falls, he won't stop there." He warned against the danger of appeasing this new Hitler, insinuating that if we do, things might turn out the way they did with Nazi Germany in 1938. Merz reminded his audience that, quote, "Just as the Sudetenland was not enough in 1938, Putin will not stop. This is a Russian aggressive war against Ukraine and against Europe."
Dass es ein Angriffskrieg Russlands gegen die Ukraine ist, gegen Europa ist. Und wenn die Ukraine fällt, dann hört er nicht auf. Und genauso wenig wie 1938 das Sudetenland nicht gereicht hat. Putin hört nicht auf.
In all this, Merz was not particularly original. This same insinuation has been regurgitated by many Western officials over the recent years, including Lech Walesa, Mateusz Morawiecki, Kaja Kallas, Gabrielius Landsbergis, who's quite a frequent user of the analogy, by Volodymyr Zelensky, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Ben Wallace, Annalena Baerbock, Marianne Strack-Zimmerman, Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, Antony Blinken, Joe Biden, and many others. It is clear that we are being sold a narrative to promote the next big European war. However, that narrative is a gross falsification of history. As a result, the truth of the 1938 appeasement episode has remained widely misunderstood. As one meme doing the rounds in social media says, "If the news is fake, imagine how bad history is." To avoid sleepwalking into another great war, it is essential that we understand what really happened in the late 1930s, and it's nothing like they taught us in school. In this three-part report, we will shed light on those deliberately obscured lessons of history. To put the story together, I drew on three main sources: Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, Guido Giacomo Preparata's Conjuring Hitler, and Dr. Jim McGregor's Hitler and Two World Wars. All three books are utter masterpieces of historiography, and I could not recommend them highly enough. Many of the aspects of this story will ring eerily familiar to all who paid attention to today's events. Buckle in, this will change how you look at the world. But before we dive in, please indulge me for a brief promotional message. I'm Alex Krainer, founder of Krainer Analytics, former market analyst, trader, and hedge fund manager. Today I publish the iSystem Trend Compass reports providing daily trend-following signals for a large variety of global financial and commodities markets. The signals are based on the iSystem technology, which has enabled me to consistently outperform my strategy benchmarks, including the world's leading blue-chip trend-following hedge funds. iSystem reduces the complexity of daily market analysis to clear, actionable decisions. Why trend following? Because markets move in trends. Trends are far and away the most powerful drivers of investment performance, and trend following is the most reliable way to profit from them. Today, You can benefit from my system trend following thanks to my daily Trend Compass reports, enabling you to navigate trends profitably with confidence and peace of mind, both in bull and bear markets. Subscriptions start at less than $1 a day for our most popular key markets report, which is available on Substack. The relevant links are provided below. The treacherous sacrifice of Czechoslovakia to Germany is one of the least well understood episodes leading to the tragedy of World War II. Conventional history associates the Czech crisis with Neville Chamberlain's appeasement at Munich. The story we were taught in school was that the British government agreed to partition Czechoslovakia only as a desperate measure to avoid greater European war. This view is based on the idea that Germany was already an overwhelming military power that could easily crush Czechoslovakia. However, this idea is patently false. In late 1938, Czechoslovakia did in fact capitulate without resistance, but this was not because her defenses were weak. Rather, Czechoslovakia's government was paralyzed and sedated as a result of the treacherous scheming of the British secret diplomacy. Created in 1919, Czechoslovakia was the most prosperous, most democratic, most powerful, and best administered of the states that emerged from the Habsburg Empire. Situated along its northwest frontier with Germany was the Sudeten region, which was the most industrialized part of the country and had a majority German population. Although Czechoslovakia instituted equitable treatment for all of its minorities, in the 1930s, Sudeten Germans began to press for greater political power and autonomy within Czechoslovakia. They established their own Nazi party, and with funding from Berlin, their relentless agitation and propaganda became a destabilizing factor for the nation. In 1934, the Czech government finally banned the party, but under Konrad Henlein's leadership, they merely changed the party's name to Sudeten German Party and continued to consolidate influence and power. Henlein coordinated the party's agenda with Hitler, and their strategy was to keep pressing the Czech government for ever greater concessions, which escalated the crisis to a boiling point in 1938. Conventional history holds that Britain only became involved in the crisis in order to prevent a greater war from erupting. The Wikipedia entry says that, quote, Germany had started a low-intensity, undeclared war on Czechoslovakia on 17 September 1938. In reaction, on 20th September, the United Kingdom and France formally asked Czechoslovakia to cede territory to Germany. That pretty much sums up history as it is still being taught in schools everywhere. The truth is very different. As early as March 1938, British representatives already had a very active role in negotiations between the Germans and the Czech government, and they remained involved until the very end of the Czech crisis. Behind the false cloak of impartiality, the British consistently encouraged the Germans to bolster their demands and pressured the Czechs to yield. The Czech government responded by offering substantial concessions and formulating a plan for minorities that included economic benefits, cultural and administrative autonomy, and even political federalism. But all that was brushed aside by the German and British representatives as inadequate. Then, on 24 April 1938, Henlein formulated the extreme Carlsbad demands. After months of torturous negotiations and under severe pressure from Britain, in September of 1938, the Czech government yielded on most of these demands. But at that point, rather than declaring victory and accepting this settlement, Henlein abruptly broke off the negotiations and fled to Germany. The standard historical narrative invariably presented the Czech situation as a lost cause, since the overwhelming power of the German Wehrmacht could easily crush Czechoslovakia's weak defenses. Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler is regarded as an ill-advised and cowardly policy, but ultimately a well-intentioned bid to prevent a greater European war. But all that was a lie. The idea that Germany had a military advantage and that Czech security was weak were both fabrications of a sustained propaganda campaign, which was orchestrated by the British media and foreign policy establishment in order to mislead the British and European public. To be sure, Germany had been building up its military power since the early 1930s, but in 1938 it was still no match for Czech defenses. The Germans had 35 infantry divisions and only 4 motorized divisions, none of them fully manned or fully equipped. Of these, only 22 partially trained divisions were stationed near the Czech frontier. At the same time, Czechoslovakia had 34 fully equipped divisions and was able to mobilize and fully armed 1 million troops. They also had hundreds of tanks that were among the most advanced tanks in Europe at the time. Moreover, the Czech army was better trained, had very high morale, and had built powerful fortifications along its borders. In terms of quality, armaments, and fortifications, the Czech army was known to be the best in Europe and was superior to the German army in every way except for air support. On September 3, 1938, the British military attaché in Prague wrote a cable to London stating, quote, "There are no shortcomings in the Czech army as far as I have been able to observe." In addition, Czech security was supported by strategic alliances with France and the Soviet Union, both of whom were at the time very keen on holding Germany in check, and both of whom were significantly superior to Germany in terms of military strength. Germany's military leaders were very well aware of all this and believed that even without her alliances, Czechoslovakia could easily defeat the German army in any military confrontation. It was for this reason that when on 21st April 1938 Hitler ordered General Wilhelm Keitel to draft plans to invade Czechoslovakia, the German military brass were deeply alarmed about this. So much so that a group of top commanders, led by Hitler's chief of the General Staff, General Ludwig Beck, hatched a 3-stage strategy to disrupt the reckless plan. First, they would try to dissuade Hitler from attacking Czechoslovakia. Second, they implored the British to stand firmly by Czechoslovakia and warned Hitler that Britain would oppose him. Third, if Hitler persisted in this resolve to wage war, they would proceed to assassinate him. The date for Hitler's assassination was set for 28 September 1938. Please keep that date in mind as our story continues. During the frenzied first 2 weeks of September 1938, message after message was communicated to London by high-level German government officials, like Baron Ernst von Weizsäcker, Erich Kord, and as well as a number of military officials and various German missions in Europe. But not only did the British ignore all these pleas for help, they even took measures to shield Hitler from General Beck's conspiracy. Chamberlain himself flew to Germany twice during the peak of the crisis in order to broker an agreement that would enable Hitler to seize Czechoslovakia without having to wage war. Foreign policy of Britain was run by a small group of men led by the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. It included Lord Halifax, Sir Horace Wilson, Sir John Simon, Lord Runciman, and Sir Samuel Hoare. Their objective was to advance the 3-block vision of the global order, which entailed securing Germany's hegemony over Central and Eastern Europe. This secret agenda was set well ahead of events and represented a blueprint for the war's initial stages. On 19 November 1937, Lord Halifax visited Hitler at his Alpine residence, where he told him that Britain considered Germany as a bastion against communism and that his government had no objection to German acquisition of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig. 4 months later, on 13 March 1938, Germany annexed Austria, in fact. Czechoslovakia was next. Lord Halifax presented the plan for Czechoslovakia to her ambassador in London on 25 May 1938. It included 3 key provisions. First, the separation of Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Second, neutralization of the rest of Czechoslovakia by revising her treaties with Russia and France. And third, an international guarantee of this rump Czechoslovakia, although not by Britain. That, in fact, was the same arrangement that would be forced on Czechs in Munich 4 months later. For the British, it was essential to achieve these objectives without a war, and in June 1938, Germany's ambassador to London, Herbert von Dirksen, wrote to Joachim von Ribbentrop that, quote, "Anything which can be got without a shot being fired can count upon agreement from the British. From their side, the British maneuvered the Czech government to yield to all German demands without resistance. Avoiding war was important for a number of reasons. First, the British wanted Germany to capture Czechoslovakia's military assets and industrial facilities intact. Furthermore, they needed to preempt Czechoslovakia's allies, Russia and France, from coming to her aid. And finally, they wanted to prevent a strong public outcry in Britain. Moscow's efforts to intervene were consistently ignored and played down in public. Already in March of 1938, the Russians tried to form a united front against Hitler and proposed holding a security conference in Bucharest, along with France, Britain, Poland, and Romania. But their initiative was simply ignored. The French position was neutered through Anglo-French Conference of September 18, 1938, where the British maneuvered the French to back London's solution to the Czech crisis and to help pressure the Czechs to capitulate to German demands without a fight. The cabal in London also needed to sell all this to the British public, which was viscerally opposed to Nazism. Accordingly, British officials and the media launched a propaganda campaign that gathered pace throughout the crisis. The opening salvo was launched with an article in Lord Rothermere's Daily Mail published on 6 May 1938. It denounced Czechoslovakia as an artificial monstrosity and an aberration of 1919. It also falsely accused the hateful Czechs of mistreating the German-speaking population, an outrage that Britain could not tolerate. In addition to demonizing Czechoslovakia, the media also fomented a general war scare. Anxiety about the relentless German mobilization was built up day by day, convincing the public to believe the lie that Germany could easily overwhelm the Czechs in a few days and wipe out Prague. By late September 1938, the war psychosis was intensified to fever pitch with reports that German Air Force might immediately launch an air raid against Paris or London and bomb the civilian population with poison gas ordnance. As panic set in, the British government escalated it by setting up stands where the people of London could be fit with gas masks. King George and Prime Minister Chamberlain called on the Britons to dig trenches in the parks and squares of London. School children began to be evacuated to secure detention facilities away from London. Every report or rumor that exacerbated the panic was played up, and any voice that encouraged taking a decisive stand against Germany was sidelined. At the same time, France and Britain ordered the Czech government not to mobilize its troops for fear of provoking Germany. Instead, they pressured Prague to accept the Anglo-French solution to the crisis, but their proposal would only further weaken Czechoslovakia's security in exchange for vague promises of international guarantees. The government of President Edvard Beneš protested vigorously and rejected the solution. In their turn, London and Paris rejected the Czech refusal and mounted further pressure on the government in Prague. Chamberlain explained the imperative to force Czechoslovakia's government to yield. Quote, "The idea of territorial cession would be likely to have a more favorable reception from the British public if it could be represented as the choice of the Czechoslovak government themselves, and it could be made clear that they had been offered the choice of a plebiscite or of territorial cession and had preferred the latter. This would dispose of any idea that we were ourselves carving up Czechoslovak territory." To turn up the pressure, France threatened to revoke her alliance and abandon the Czechs to Germany. Finally, on 21 September 1938, the Czech government relented and accepted the Anglo-French dictate. The very next day, Chamberlain paid Hitler a visit at Godesberg on the Rhine in order to personally deliver the good news. At that meeting, Hitler and Chamberlain formulated the extreme Godesberg ultimatum, a set of even more exacting demands against the Czechoslovak government, and had the British military attaché rush them to Prague. Hitler now inexplicably demanded self-determination not only for the Sudeten Germans, but also for the Poles, Hungarians, and Slovaks. In addition, German troops were to enter Czechoslovakia before the 1st of October 1938 and occupy portions of Czechoslovakia that would be determined at Hitler's own discretion. The ultimatum was presented as Hitler's own brainchild, but it is almost certain that it was godfathered by Chamberlain himself. Back in London on 23rd September, the British cabinet ostensibly rejected Hitler's Godesberg ultimatum and agreed to support France if she chose to go to war against Germany. The French government also rejected Hitler's ultimatum, as did the Czechs. The Soviets responded by explicitly reiterating their security commitment to Czechoslovakia. However, this last-moment appearance of a united front against an aggressive Germany was yet another deception. On 27 September 1938, Chamberlain delivered a radio address to the nation, feigning his dismay at the incomprehensible events on the continent. Quote, "How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing." The very same day, Chamberlain sent a telegram to Czechoslovakia's President Beneš, warning him that if he failed to accept Hitler's ultimatum by 2 p.m. on the following day, which was 28 September 1938, Czechoslovakia would be overrun by the German army and nothing could save her. Recall, there was a reason why 28 September was important. That was the date on which the military brass, led by General Ludwig Beck, planned to assassinate Hitler if he insisted on attacking Czechoslovakia. After sending the ultimatum to President Beneš, Chamberlain reached out to Hitler to propose holding a four-power conference, reassuring him that Britain and France would force Czechoslovakia to accept any agreement on condition that Germany abstained from going to war. The following day, that same 28 September 1938, at 3 p.m., Chamberlain appeared at the House of Commons, where he gave a long speech about the events in Europe. His speech caused great consternation among the MPs, who sat aghast, wondering if Göring's bombs were about to start raining on London. In a theatrical stunt near the end of his speech, a message was brought to him, and he announced at once that it was an invitation to a four-power conference in Munich. Chamberlain forgot to mention that he himself had organized the conference, but the MPs were not inclined to question the good news. They erupted in a roar of relief, and Chamberlain immediately hurried from the building without a formal ending to the session. In Munich on 30th September 1938, Chamberlain, Hitler, Mussolini, and Francis Daladier carved up Czechoslovakia without consulting anybody else, least of all the Czechs. The Four Powers Agreement was handed to the Czech minister in Berlin, who had been waiting outside the doors for over 10 hours. It reached Prague only 18 hours before the German occupation was to begin. The agreement itself was an abomination. It provided that some designated areas of Czechoslovakia would be occupied by Germany in several stages during the first and second weeks of October 1938. The progress of the occupation would be supervised by an international commission. A joint German-Czech commission would order and supervise public referenda and guarantee the rights of various ethnicities who would have a 6-month grace period to move into and out of the areas designated under the agreement. Property was to be protected, and none of it was to be seized by the occupying troops. The remainder of Czechoslovakia would be guaranteed by France and Britain, with Germany and Italy joining the guarantee as soon as the Polish and Hungarian minority issues had been settled. However, the whole Munich agreement was utterly worthless. It merely put a thin veil of diplomatic decorum over the real agenda, which was a brazen act of destruction of a prosperous European nation with the premeditated objective of empowering Nazi Germany and pushing the people of Europe closer to the single greatest tragedy in their history. Almost before the ink could dry on this shameful document, it was violated on every point in favor of Germany, which simply occupied whatever areas of Czechoslovakia it chose to. The nation's infrastructure was severely impaired, and every important railroad or highway was cut or crippled, almost instantly collapsing the Czech economy. The international commission that was set up to oversee the occupation process in reality simply rubber-stamped every decision of the German General Staff. For their neutrality, Poland and Hungary were subsequently rewarded with chunks of Czechoslovakia. Hungary obtained the southern portions of Czechoslovakia, while Poland took the areas with a Polish minority. Czechoslovakia's Soviet alliance was abolished and the Communist Party outlawed. Anti-Nazi refugees from Sudetenland were rounded up by the new government in Prague and handed over to the Germans to be destroyed. The stipulated guarantee of the rump of Czechoslovakia was simply ignored. As for the promised referenda, they were ignored as well. Anti-Nazi refugees from Sudetenland were rounded up by the new government in Prague and handed over to the Germans to be destroyed. The stipulated guarantee of the rump of Czechoslovakia was ignored. As for the promised referenda, they were simply forgotten. All that the Munich Agreement accomplished was to give Hitler everything he demanded and more, but without the costs and casualties of war. As a result, Nazi Germany was made the supreme power in Central Europe, and any possibility of checking its hegemony on the continent was lost. This was exactly as Chamberlain intended it. When German troops overran Czechoslovakia, they captured 469 tanks, which were much superior to German tanks, along with 1,500 planes, 43,000 machine guns, and more than 1 million rifles. The unused arsenal was a testament to the power that failed to defend itself against Hitler's aggression. It was sedated and paralyzed through the devious scheming of the British foreign policy cabal, led by Neville Chamberlain. Hitler was not happy with the results of the Four Powers Conference. He seemingly felt cheated out of a war and said that Munich would be his first and certainly his last international conference. The next time, he said, he hoped that no dirty pig would suggest a conference. By dirty pig, he was referring to Neville Chamberlain. Hitler also had no intention to abide by the agreement reached in Munich. By early March 1939, German troops were poised to occupy the rump of Czechoslovakia, and there was nothing to stop them. On 14th March 1939, Hitler summoned Czechoslovak puppet President Hacha to Berlin, where he forced him to sign documents handing the nation over to Germany and ordering all resistance to the invading German forces to stand down. Within a week, Bohemia-Moravia was declared a German protectorate. Standard historical narrative holds that the events of March 1939 finally revealed Hitler's true intentions and marked the end of the naive policy of appeasement. But for Chamberlain and his co-conspirators, up until that point, the events were unfolding exactly as intended. However, for their plans to proceed unopposed, it was necessary to continue deceiving the British people. When Hitler broke the Munich Agreement and annexed Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain issued a feeble protest. But on 15th March, he explicitly accepted Germany's seizure of Czechoslovakia in the House of Commons and refused to accuse Hitler of bad faith. 2 days later, on 17th March, he faced his constituents in Birmingham and made a show of denouncing Hitler's actions before them. But even if he publicly declared the seizure of Czechoslovakia as illegal, his government immediately accepted it as a fact and recognized it as law by accrediting the British Consulate General in Prague to Germany. As the public outrage mounted, on 28 March 1939, Chamberlain made a further gesture in announcing the cancellation of trade talks with Germany, as well as the planned visit to Berlin of the British Board of Trade, led by its president, Oliver Stanley. True to form, however, only 5 days later, the German commercial attaché in London was secretly informed that the British were ready to reopen the discussions. In May 1939, Bank of England's Montagu Norman turned over to Germany the £6 million in Czech gold reserves that were held in London. When the news of this transfer leaked out, the cabinet hid behind the preposterous excuse that the British government could not control the actions of the Bank of England. Their unblemished hands were tied, you see. Following the destruction of Czechoslovakia, Hitler turned his attention to Poland. At first it was just diplomacy. The talks with Poland kicked off on 21 October 1938. As expected, German representatives asked the Polish government for the city of Danzig and a kilometer-wide strip across the Polish corridor to accommodate a highway and a 4-track railroad under the German sovereignty. These were deemed moderate requests, and they were made to the Polish ally in a relatively cordial atmosphere. The territories in question were parts of Germany that she'd lost by Versailles Treaty after World War I, so German demands didn't seem outrageous. At that time, Hitler did not intend to overrun Poland, but rather to engage her in the forthcoming invasion of Russia. If his demands were granted, Germany was prepared to reciprocate with certain concessions to Poland. However, the Polish government did not yield to German demands. A few months later, on 21 March 1939, Hitler reiterated his demand, this time more forcefully. When the news of this reached London, UK's Prime Minister Chamberlain suddenly and unilaterally issued a strangely worded security guarantee for Poland. It read as follows, quote, "Certain consultations are now proceeding with other governments. In order to make perfectly clear the position of His Majesty's government, in the meantime, before those consultations are concluded, I now have to inform the House that during that period, in the event of any action which clearly threatened Polish independence, and which the Polish government accordingly considered it vital to resist with their national forces, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power." Unquote. This was the first time Britain made such a commitment to another nation since 1918. Not only did British government commit to guarantee a foreign nation, it also gave that nation the privilege to decide when the guarantee would take effect while asking for nothing in return. Importantly, the British only guaranteed Poland's independence, not its territorial integrity. In that, they left the door wide open for Germany to continue pressuring Poland for territorial concessions. In July 1939, about 2 months after Chamberlain's guarantee of Poland's independence, the Reich Commissioner for Germany's four-year plan, Helmut Wohltat, came to London to attend an international whaling conference. On that occasion, he was approached by Chamberlain's personal representative, Sir Horace Wilson, who communicated to him the proposals which the British government wished to discuss with Germany. They included 1. A non-aggression pact between Britain and Germany, 2. A delimitation of spheres of interest, 3. Colonial concessions in Africa, 4. An economic agreement, and 5. A disarmament agreement. German ambassador to London, Herbert von Dirksen, reported about these contacts to Berlin, stating that, quote, Sir Horace Wilson definitely told Herr Wohltat that the conclusion of a non-aggression pact would enable Britain to rid herself of her commitments vis-à-vis Poland. Britain's guarantee emboldened the Polish leadership to harden their stance vis-à-vis Germany, in the mistaken belief that Britain and France would have unleashed a full-scale offensive against Germany if Hitler decided to strike at Poland. Unaware of the British guarantee at first, Hitler was surprised by Poland's sudden defiance. But if the intention of the British guarantee was to deter Germany, its effect was exactly the opposite. When Hitler did learn about it, he immediately decided to attack Poland. During a secret conference with his generals on 23 May 1939, Hitler said that, quote, "The Polish problem is inseparable from the conflict with the West. Poland sees danger in a German victory in the West and will attempt to rob us of a victory there. There is therefore no question of sparing Poland, and we are left with the decision to attack Poland at the first suitable opportunity." The plan was hatched to launch the attack before September 1939. Beyond Chamberlain's bizarre verbal guarantee, Britain did next to nothing to ensure Poland's security. It made no real effort to build up a defense front with Poland, and no military arrangements were made as to how Britain and Poland would cooperate in a war. Britain's efforts to rearm Poland were delivered late, in insufficient amounts, in an unworkable form. At the same time, London continued to provide very substantial support to Germany. In May 1939, when Chamberlain issued his guarantee, there was talk about a £100 million loan to Poland, but the British stalled and delayed, delivering far too little and far too late. Poland finally obtained a small credit of just over $8 million only 1 month before the German invasion. At the same time, as Quigley wrote, all London was buzzing about a secret loan of £1 billion from Britain to Germany, more than 100 times the meager credit extended to Poland. The rumors were in fact corroborated by Hitler himself. Speaking of these events at a later date, in August 1942, he said, quote, "Schacht had told me that we had at our disposal a credit of 1,500 million marks abroad, and it was on this basis that I planned for my 4-year plan, which never caused me the slightest anxiety. And this is how things stand today, and we never find ourselves blocked for money." The Schacht that Hitler was referring to was his then economy minister Hjalmar Schacht, former Wall Street banker, head of the Reichsbanks, and a very close associate of the Bank of England's governor, Montagu-Norman. Far from discouraging German aggression, British actions only bolstered Hitler in his determination. During a secret conference with his generals held on 22 August 1939, Hitler said, quote, "The following is characteristic of England. Poland wanted a loan from England for rearmament. England, however, gave only a credit to make sure that Poland buys in England, although England cannot deliver. This means that England does not really want to support Poland." Of course, Hitler was right. Britain only signed a formal alliance with Poland on 25 August 1939, the very day when Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland, and far too late to change the course of events. At the time when British public opinion was deeply opposed to Nazi Germany, that move was intended more to appease the British public than to provide any meaningful support to Poland. But the fact that Britain did in fact have considerable influence to change the course of events became apparent. Upon learning of the British-Polish alliance, the stubborn, unstoppable Hitler immediately reversed his orders to invade Poland, only a few hours after he had issued them. However, the pause wasn't used to sue for peace, and after a week's delay, the invasion went ahead on September 1, 1939. Keeping up the appearance of trying to restrain Hitler while covertly aiding and abetting him was the hallmark of British secret diplomacy through much of the late 1930s. Referring to this period, American historian Carroll Quigley wrote that, quote, "In general, the key to everything was the position of Britain." At that time, Britain was the dominant power in the world diplomacy, exerting disproportionate influence in Europe and much of the world. It controlled the maritime trade routes and the flow of capital through London, which reigned supreme as the world's financial capital. Nearly all governments in Europe conducted foreign policy in consultations with London. All this begs the question, why did Britain so consistently miss every chance to preserve peace on the continent and restrain Hitler? Why did the British and American corporations and bankers provide such ample support to Nazi Germany, even when it was abundantly clear that most of this support was being used for rearmament? We can glean the answer to these questions in the wider agenda behind their geopolitics. Britain's secret policy agenda for Germany was set well before the war. It was in fact the blueprint for the war's initial stages. As we've already seen, on 19 November 1937, one of the key exponents of British foreign policy, Lord Halifax, met with Hitler and encouraged him to take over Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig. Over the following 2 years, Hitler did exactly that. We might ask, why would the British encourage Hitler to do this? Their support for Hitler was in fact a part of their larger three-block world agenda. After the Munich conference in September 1938, Lord Halifax revealed how the ruling establishment envisioned those three blocks. The first block consisted of Germany as the dominant power on the continent with predominant rights in southeastern Europe. The second block was Britain dominating Euro-Atlantic West in alliance with the United States, and the third was securing Far Eastern dominions in alliance with Japan. Accordingly, Germany would be built up and supported not only as a dominating power in Central and Eastern Europe, but also as a bludgeon to use against Russia. With that objective in mind, the British establishment had formulated a more detailed 7-point policy towards Germany, which was communicated to German officials by various spokesmen from 1937 onward. 1. Hitler's Germany was the frontline bulwark against the spread of communism in Europe. 2. A four-power pact of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany was to prevent all Russian influence in Europe as the ultimate objective. Accordingly, Britain had no desire to weaken the Rome-Berlin axis. 3. Britain had no objection to German acquisition of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig. 4. Germany must not use force to achieve its aims in Europe, and as this could precipitate a war in which Britain would have to intervene because of the pressure of public opinion in Britain and the French system of alliances. With patience, Germany could get all of its aims without using force. 5. Britain wanted an agreement with Germany restricting the numbers and the use of bombing planes. 6. Britain was prepared, conditionally, to give Germany colonial areas in South-Central Africa, including the Belgian Congo and Portuguese Angola. 7. Britain would use pressure on Czechoslovakia and Poland to negotiate with Germany and to be conciliatory to Germany's desires. After the Munich crisis and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, an eighth point was added to the program, which entailed economic support for Germany. Thus, Germany's expansion through 1939 was the result of a covert policy that deliberately created a monster at the heart of Europe. Not only did Britain's secret diplomacy support Hitler, they actually directed the events from behind the curtains. The parallels between the 1930s and today's events shouldn't come as a surprise. Hitler's ultimate goal was the destruction of Russia. Today, the obsessive drive to destroy Russia has pushed the eastward expansion of NATO and the militarization of Ukraine. While Nazism was defeated in World War II at a massive cost in lives and treasure, the same structures of power that financed and empowered Hitler have continued to shape global geopolitics to this day. They have not given up on their vision of a three-block world, which is perhaps most visibly represented by the Trilateral Commission, one of the most influential think tanks in the world. Founded in July 1973, the Trilateral Commission's aim is to foster close cooperation between Japan, Western Europe, and North America. But unlike in the 30s, today the control of continental Europe is being pursued through the ostensibly democratic political institutions of the European Union, rather than by conquest and brute military force. Even here, however, Germany has emerged as the dominant power among the supposed equals, and today the leaders in Germany, along with those in France and Britain, seem obsessed with going to war with Russia. It is hard to overestimate the recklessness of this obsession. World War I resulted in some 40 million casualties. World War II cost about 85 million. World War III could be far worse and should never even be contemplated. For all of us who want future generations to know peace and prosperity, this is the time for our voices to be heard loud and clear and to pray for peace. When our leaders ask us to sacrifice our children for their wars, our response should be a loud, resounding, and unyielding no. Well, if you made it to the end, thank you for the companionship. I hope you found this report interesting. I plan to produce more, so please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. And if you manage your own investment portfolio, don't forget to check out the Trend Compass. Quite possibly the best trend following newsletter out there. And remember, our Key Markets daily report on Substack is priced at less than $1 a day. You'll find all the relevant links below. Until the next time, keep well, stay free, and I'll see you soon.